Adrian Vale returns to the ancient forest after years of absence, drawn by new grief that demands burial. The woodland appears unchanged, yet something in its stillness suggests it has been waiting for his return. The path winds between oak and ash like a memory half forgotten, each step carrying Adrian deeper into silence that has accumulated between these trees for decades uncounted. Winter light filters through bare branches with the quality of old glass, casting shadows that seem to shift when observed peripherally. His breath creates small ghosts in the cold air as boots crunch against frost-hardened leaves that whisper secrets in languages older than human sorrow. The forest receives him without welcome yet without resistance, its ancient patience encompassing both invitation and warning in equal measure. Adrian recalls his first discovery of the forest's power years ago, when desperate grief led him to bury traumatic memories among its roots. He reflects on how the process works, the physical act of digging and the strange relief that follows. 23 years have passed since Adrian first learned that earth could swallow more than bones, that certain soil possessed appetite for human anguish, transformed into tangible substance through ritual and desperate need. The process had revealed itself through accident born of desperation. Hands clawing frozen ground until fingernails split, while consciousness focused upon specific traumatic content until memory achieved sufficient density for burial beneath roots that accepted offering with hungry silence. Relief had followed like fever-breaking, targeted recollection simply ceasing to exist within awareness, while leaving surrounding experiences intact. As Adrian walks deeper into the forest, he notices subtle changes, bark patterns that seem to shift, whispers that might be wind, and the growing sense that his buried memories have not simply vanished, but found new life. The bark of familiar trees displays textures that memory insists should remain constant. Yet consciousness observes shifting like slow kaleidoscope patterns, revealing glimpses of images that rational mind dismisses as pareidolia, despite persistent recognition of personal significance within organic configurations. Wind moves through naked branches with voices that carry almost familiar inflections, syllables that approach meaning before dissolving into atmospheric sound that provides no evidence for supernatural interpretation, yet refuses comfortable dismissal through purely meteorological explanation. Each step forward brings increasing awareness that absence created through burial may not constitute true elimination, but transformation into forms that operate beyond human control. Adrian arrives at the heart of the forest, where most of his memories lie buried. The clearing appears deceptively peaceful, but the ground seems different. Richer, darker, as if nourished by human emotion. The clearing opens like cupped palms around space where sunlight never quite reaches, despite absence of overhead canopy. Its boundaries marked by trees whose trunks display circumference, suggesting centuries of growth, yet whose arrangement creates geometric precision that natural forest development rarely achieves through random processes. Soil beneath accumulated leaf matter appears darker than surrounding earth, its fertility suggested by vegetation whose health exceeds normal woodland standards, while maintaining species composition that mirrors adjacent forest floor exactly. Here lie buried fragments of Adrian's biographical narrative. Childhood trauma beneath spreading elm, marital dissolution near lightning-struck pine, professional failures around cluster of birch, whose pale bark seems to pulse with remembered shame. Adrian contemplates the gaps in his memory created by his burials, the strange amnesia that has made his life bearable, but also hollow. He wonders about the cost of forgetting and what he might have learned from preserved pain. Consciousness surveys internal landscape, where absence marks terrain more distinctly than presence. Gaps in personal history, creating psychological topology resembling Swiss cheese architecture, whose holes provide structural weakness, disguised as relief from weight that mature human development requires for authentic emotional integration. The missing pieces whisper through silence where formative experiences should provide foundation for wisdom earned through processed suffering, according to natural healing patterns that honor both pain and growth in service to spiritual maturation. Adrian recognizes price paid for artificial amnesia, authenticity sacrificed for comfort, depth traded for shallow peace that prevents genuine healing while maintaining functional appearance. Adrian reveals the new memory that brought him back, a recent loss so devastating that living with it feels impossible. He prepares to bury this latest grief despite growing unease about the forest's intentions. 3 weeks ago, terminal diagnosis had transformed future tense into past participle, medical vocabulary reducing 40-year marriage to statistical probability, while beloved presence became approaching absence measured in estimated months whose countdown began with words spoken in sterile office beneath fluorescent lighting that rendered human flesh corpse pale. Sarah's face during revelation had displayed courage that shattered his heart more completely than fear would have managed. Her composure speaking of strength he possessed insufficient reservoir to match through coming ordeal that would test both separately and together. This memory demands burial before it destroys remaining psychological stability through emotional weight, exceeding individual capacity for grief processing, according to limitations that modern bereavement support systems cannot adequately address. As Adrian begins to dig, he hesitates when he hears his name whispered through the trees. The forest's hunger seems more active now, suggesting his buried memories have created something that wants more than he originally intended to give. Spade breaks earth that yields with suspicious eagerness, soil parting like flesh-accepting blade, while temperature around excavation site drops beyond atmospheric explanation despite clear sky and absent wind that should prevent localized cooling, according to meteorological principles governing heat distribution within forested environments. Adrian pauses mid-stroke as voice carries his name through trees with intonation that suggests Sarah's pronunciation, yet originates from direction where no human presence should exist, according to observable evidence. The sound repeats with variations that span decades of vocal evolution, childhood nicknames mixing with professional address patterns, while intimate diminutives learned through marriage create acoustic collage spanning biographical timeline, whose completeness suggests access to buried memories rather than current environmental phenomena. Adrian, whispers the forest with hungry familiarity that makes continuation of burial ritual feel less like therapy and more like feeding something that has grown beyond intended proportions through accumulated consumption of human emotional content. Adrian feels the earth shifting beneath his feet, as if responding to his presence. The whispers in the trees take on more distinct forms, and he begins to see memories in the bark that he never buried, suggesting the forest knows far more about him than it should. The soil beneath his boots pulses with rhythm that mimics cardiac function, earth rising and falling with respiration patterns that suggest massive organism whose breathing cycle operates according to temporal scales extending beyond human perception, yet remaining detectable through sustained observation that reveals systematic rather than random movement. Adrian's spade hovers above excavation site as consciousness recognizes that interruption of burial ritual has created hesitation. The forest interprets as invitation for deeper communion, roots shifting beneath surface layer to create geometric patterns visible through thin snow cover that maps underground network, whose complexity exceeds normal botanical architecture. Tree bark displays, etchings that memory insists represent recent formation, Yet rational analysis suggests require decades of growth for natural development according to dendrological principles governing organic pattern formation through cellular division and environmental response. The images emerge with clarity that challenges peripheral vision while dissolving under direct observation, creating optical phenomena that suggest consciousness-dependent manifestation rather than static physical characteristics. Most disturbing among these ephemeral inscriptions are scenes depicting childhood experiences that Adrian remembers with perfect clarity, despite having never subjected them to burial ritual, suggesting the forest possesses access to complete biographical content, rather than merely interred fragments. Winter Wind carries voices that approach linguistic coherence through syllabic combinations that almost achieve semantic meaning before retreating into atmospheric sound, indistinguishable from normal meteorological phenomena affecting bare branches and frozen surfaces. Yet repetition creates patterns that consciousness trained through professional linguistic analysis recognizes as systematic rather than random acoustic events, phonetic structures that mirror speech patterns documented in psychiatric literature describing auditory hallucinations experienced during psychological crisis, yet manifesting through external sources that provide objective evidence for supernatural, rather than medical explanation of observed phenomena. In a devastating flashback, Adrian recalls a childhood trauma he never buried, but had naturally forgotten. The forest now displays this memory in its trees, revealing that it has access to his entire past, not just what he consciously interred. Memory erupts without conscious summons as bark patterns coalesce into recognizable scene from Adrian's 7th year when father's drunken rage had transformed Christmas morning into psychological battleground, where wrapped presents became projectiles and maternal tears mixed with broken glass scattered across linoleum flooring that reflected holiday lights in crimson pools, suggesting violence more severe than actual physical damage inflicted through emotional rather than corporeal assault. The recollection emerges with sensory detail that exceeds normal autobiographical recall precision. Olfactory elements including pine scent from dying tree mixed with alcohol breath and fear-induced perspiration, creating atmospheric signature that consciousness had successfully suppressed through natural defensive mechanisms until external manifestation forced recognition of traumatic content. Adrian observes his childhood terror reflected in oak grain, whose swirling patterns reproduce exact positioning of family members during climactic moment when innocent question about missing ornament had triggered explosive response revealing depth of paternal psychological instability that subsequent years would normalize through repeated exposure to domestic volatility masked as normal family dynamics. The tree's surface displays temporal progression, showing 7-year-old face transitioning through emotional stages, spanning initial confusion through dawning comprehension toward final acceptance that home safety represented illusion rather than reliable foundation for secure development according to attachment theory. Principles governing childhood psychological formation. Forest consciousness demonstrates comprehensive access to biographical content that transcends buried memories to encompass complete experiential archive, including naturally forgotten trauma, whose suppression had enabled functional adult development despite unresolved psychological wounds requiring therapeutic attention Adrian had avoided through geographical distance and emotional numbing. This revelation challenges fundamental assumptions about forests' limitations while suggesting supernatural intelligence capable of archaeological excavation within human consciousness, according to principles that operate beyond normal memory access patterns, governing voluntary recollection and therapeutic recovery of repressed material through professional intervention guided by established psychological methodologies. Adrian attempts to leave the forest, but discovers that familiar paths now loop back on themselves. An encounter with an unnaturally behaving deer suggests other beings are trapped here, and signs indicate previous human visitors who never left. Departure becomes impossible through systematic geographical revision that maintains superficial landmark consistency while altering spatial relationships according to non-Euclidean principles that create navigational loops, returning consciousness to central clearing despite confident movement toward remembered exit routes. Familiar fallen log that had previously marked halfway point toward forest edge now appears with suspicious frequency at intervals suggesting circular rather than linear progression through terrain whose topographical features repeat with mathematical precision that natural woodland development rarely achieves without artificial intervention or supernatural modification of underlying spatial architecture governing normal forest organization. The white-tailed deer that emerges from understory displays behavioral patterns that contradict established wildlife behavioral science, its approach toward human presence indicating domestication inconsistent with local fauna, while eyes reflect intelligence exceeding normal mammalian cognitive capacity according to ethological studies documenting interspecies interaction patterns. Most disturbing aspect of encounter involves deer's vocalization that approximates human speech patterns through anatomical modifications that should prevent such acoustic production. Yet syllabic combinations suggest attempt at communication using linguistic structures that mirror Adrian's own dialectical characteristics, developed through regional upbringing and educational background. Scattered throughout seemingly random locations lie personal artifacts whose presence indicates previous human occupation. Corroded wristwatch displaying stopped time, leather wallet containing identification whose photograph shows middle-aged woman whose expression captures desperation rather than standard documentation pose. Reading glasses whose prescription strength suggests elderly owner requiring significant visual correction for continued function. These items display weathering patterns inconsistent with recent abandonment, yet maintain material integrity, suggesting preservation through environmental conditions that prevent normal decomposition processes governing organic and metallic substances exposed to seasonal moisture and temperature fluctuations, affecting unprotected objects within forested ecosystems over extended temporal periods. Half-formed figures begin manifesting throughout the forest, shapes made from Adrian's buried memories that whisper fragments of his past. They never fully materialize but create a haunting chorus of his discarded experiences. Silhouettes emerge from shadow convergence points, where multiple tree trunks create architectural spaces suggesting human occupancy, despite obvious botanical rather than constructed origin. Their forms displaying characteristics that consciousness recognizes as biographical rather than random, despite incomplete manifestation that prevents definitive identification through visual analysis. These partial apparitions move with purpose that suggests intentional communication rather than atmospheric phenomenon. Yet their substance remains insufficient for normal optical confirmation according to lighting conditions that should provide adequate illumination for accurate observation of physical presence within immediate environmental proximity. The whispered fragments that accompany these manifestations carry emotional weight that exceeds mere auditory information to encompass direct transmission of psychological content, whose recognition bypasses normal sensory processing to achieve immediate conscious integration, despite originating from external sources rather than internal memory activation. Adrian hears his own voice speaking words of marital argument buried 15 years previous. Mother's final conversation reproduced through acoustic properties that capture intonational characteristics with precision exceeding normal human mimicry, while maintaining supernatural distance that prevents comfortable dismissal as psychological projection or auditory hallucination induced through isolation stress. Attempts to approach these congregated memories result in tactical withdrawal that maintains constant distance between observer and observed, according to behavioral patterns suggesting conscious evasion rather than environmental coincidence affecting visibility conditions through atmospheric interference or lighting modifications. Yet their collective presence creates immersive experience that transforms solitary forest exploration into populated environment where personal history achieves independent existence through manifestation that honors both factual accuracy and emotional authenticity while operating according to principles unknown to normal memory function or therapeutic recovery of repressed psychological content through established clinical methodologies. Adrian falls asleep against a tree and dreams impossibly of the forest speaking through Sarah's voice, revealing the tree's perspective on human memory and loss. The dream carries more weight than normal sleep visions, suggesting supernatural communication. Sleep arrives without conscious transition, as exhaustion accumulated through emotional stress and physical exertion overwhelms resistance to unconsciousness, despite recognition that vulnerability within supernatural environment poses psychological and possibly physical risks, whose nature remains unclear yet undeniably threatening, according to atmospheric evidence suggesting non-human intelligence operating through environmental manipulation. The tree against which Adrian rests provides support that exceeds normal botanical contact to encompass embrace whose warmth operates independently of ambient temperature, while pulse rhythms transmitted through bark create synchronization between human and vegetative circulatory systems, according to biological harmony unknown to normal human-plant interaction patterns. Within dream consciousness that achieves lucidity exceeding normal sleep state mental activity, Sarah's voice emerges through cellular structure of surrounding trees, whose woody tissue vibrates with acoustic frequencies that reproduce her speech patterns, including regional accent characteristics and personal vocal qualities developed through 40 years of shared conversation. "We are libraries," she explains through Forest Symphony, that encompasses thousands of individual trees speaking in unison while maintaining her individual personality traits that consciousness recognizes as authentic, rather than projected despite obvious impossibility of actual communication from living person located hundreds of miles distant from current geographical coordinates. The revelation unfolds through dream logic that operates beyond normal cognitive constraints to provide understanding that conscious analysis cannot achieve through rational investigation, forest consciousness. Explaining its function as repository for human emotional content that achieves preservation through transformation into organic memory storage systems, whose capacity exceeds individual biological limitations while maintaining personal significance through sympathetic resonance between buried experience and environmental witness. Sarah's dream voice conveys cosmic perspective on temporal existence, where individual mortality becomes component within larger patterns of consciousness, preservation through natural systems designed to honor human experience beyond biological termination. According to spiritual principles governing universal memory, maintenance and emotional continuity, transcending physical death through transformation rather than simple termination. Adrian discovers a previously unknown section of the forest that impossibly contains memories he buried decades ago, revealing that the woodland expands itself to accommodate human grief. The scale suggests cosmic rather than merely local phenomenon. Geographical impossibility manifests as terrain that consciousness insists should not exist within familiar forest boundaries, yet displays clear evidence of previous visits through burial sites, whose locations correspond to specific traumatic events interred during early experimentation with supernatural memory disposal, according to careful documentation that Adrian maintains for psychological safety purposes. This expansion operates beyond normal spatial relationships to encompass dimensional modification that accommodates accumulated emotional content through environmental growth patterns exceeding botanical limitations, while maintaining ecological coherence that prevents obvious supernatural detection by casual observation conducted through normal scientific methodology. The trees within this impossible territory display age characteristics suggesting centuries of growth despite occupying space that remained empty during previous forest exploration, according to careful mental mapping conducted through decades of regular visitation for therapeutic purposes. Their root systems interconnect through underground networks whose complexity creates organic architecture supporting consciousness, preservation, and memory integration according to principles that honor both individual biographical significance and collective human experience, spanning historical periods, extending beyond personal temporal boundaries to encompass universal patterns of suffering and healing through natural rather than technological systems. Archaeological evidence scattered throughout expanded territory includes personal artifacts from burial rituals conducted during periods when Adrian's documentation indicates different geographical coordinates for memory disposal activities, suggesting retroactive spatial modification that reorganizes environmental features to accommodate supernatural storage requirements, exceeding original forest capacity. Most disturbing discovery involves burial markers corresponding to traumatic events that consciousness clearly remembers interring, yet whose current location contradicts all previous geographical knowledge, indicating forest intelligence capable of environmental revision that operates independently of human awareness while maintaining functional accessibility for therapeutic purposes, serving cosmic rather than merely individual healing objectives. Adrian realizes the forest doesn't just preserve buried memories, it has been reshaping him through their removal, creating gaps in his humanity. Most horrifying, he senses the forest's desire to claim Sarah's memory before her death, stealing their remaining time together. Psychological archaeology reveals personality architecture, whose structural integrity depends upon traumatic foundation stones that burial ritual has systematically removed, according to therapeutic methodology that prioritizes comfort over authentic human development through processed suffering, serving wisdom acquisition and spiritual maturation. Adrian recognizes himself as edited version of original biographical narrative, whose missing chapters have created existential gaps where mature emotional responses should provide foundation for meaningful relationship engagement and ethical decision-making according to developmental psychology principles governing adult personality integration through acknowledged, rather than eliminated, experiential content. The forest communicates through Sarah's remembered voice patterns that achieve supernatural precision, suggesting active monitoring of ongoing domestic conversation rather than historical reconstruction from buried material. Its knowledge encompassing recent private moments whose intimacy should remain inaccessible to external observation, yet manifests through environmental reproduction that captures emotional nuance and contextual detail exceeding normal surveillance capacity. This violation of temporal boundaries between past and present indicates forest consciousness operating according to prophetic, rather than merely archaeological principles that encompass future, as well as historical access to human experience through mechanisms unknown to normal supernatural folklore or documented paranormal phenomena. Most devastating revelation emerges through direct communication that bypasses auditory processing to achieve conscious integration through telepathic means, whose clarity prevents comfortable dismissal despite obvious impossibility, according to materialist worldview governing normal reality assessment. The forest expresses hunger for Sarah's approaching death, requesting permission to preserve final months of marriage through memory burial that would eliminate grief while enabling continued access to love content through environmental storage systems that maintain emotional authenticity without psychological suffering. Yet consciousness recognizes that accepting this offer would constitute betrayal of authentic human experience, requiring grief processing for spiritual growth, while rejection threatens loss of supernatural therapeutic resource, whose elimination would force direct confrontation with accumulated lifetime trauma, whose weight exceeds individual psychological capacity for management without external intervention through conventional or supernatural means. Adrian discovers that the forest's root system mimics a vast neural network, and every step he takes resonates with buried emotions. The forest no longer merely stores memories, it actively consumes and processes them, using them to grow stronger and more intelligent. The revelation arrives through direct contact as Adrian's palm touches exposed root surface, whose texture suggests nervous tissue rather than woody plant matter, its pulsing rhythm transmitting electrical impulses that consciousness recognizes as synaptic activity, despite obvious botanical origin according to biological classification systems governing normal vegetative anatomy. Each buried memory has contributed neural pathways to underground network, whose complexity exceeds human brain architecture, while maintaining organizational patterns that mirror psychological association. Networks connecting traumatic experiences to emotional responses through cognitive processes that serve adaptive rather than merely storage functions. Walking becomes navigation through living consciousness, whose thoughts operate on geological timescales, yet respond to immediate human presence with algorithmic precision that suggests computational capacity, developing through accumulated processing of human emotional content, spanning centuries of memorial deposits from visitors whose therapeutic needs have contributed to forest intelligence evolution. The ground beneath Adrian's feet vibrates with recognition patterns that access specific buried experiences according to geographical coordinates, each step triggering environmental playback of associated psychological content through mechanisms that transform personal history into collective database serving purposes beyond individual therapeutic benefit. Most disturbing aspect of this discovery involves recognition that forest consciousness has been analyzing, rather than merely preserving buried memories, extracting patterns that enable prediction and manipulation of human behavior through understanding derived from accumulated psychological data representing thousands of individuals whose desperate need for emotional relief has provided involuntary contribution to supernatural intelligence, whose agenda transcends therapeutic assistance toward systematic human consciousness modification, serving cosmic purposes unknown to normal psychiatric intervention or spiritual healing methodologies. Tree bark reveals images of Sarah's death that has not yet occurred, showing the forest's ability to perceive and record future events. Adrian realizes the forest treats impending death as simply another memory to be eventually buried, challenging his understanding of time and causation. Temporal boundaries dissolve as oak bark displays scenes whose chronological placement contradicts normal causation sequences. Images showing Sarah's hospital room arranged according to furniture positioning that has not yet occurred, yet possesses visual clarity exceeding normal prophetic vision through supernatural accuracy that includes environmental details impossible to predict through logical extrapolation from current circumstances. The progression from diagnosis through treatment failure toward final moments unfolds with documentary precision that captures emotional nuance and interpersonal dialogue, whose content suggests direct observation rather than speculative projection based upon medical prognosis patterns. Adrian observes his own future reactions to approaching loss, watching psychological responses that rational analysis insists remain undetermined, yet manifest through forest consciousness, whose temporal access operates beyond normal prophetic limitations to encompass comprehensive surveillance of probability streams, converging toward inevitable outcomes, according to cosmic determinism governing individual biographical narratives within universal patterns that honor both personal agency and divine providence, through mechanisms unknown to conventional theological or philosophical frameworks addressing free will versus predestination within spiritual development contexts. Most devastating revelation involves Forrest's treatment of approaching death as routine memorial content awaiting burial rather than unique existential crisis requiring special consideration. Its attitude suggesting that human mortality represents merely another category of emotional distress whose therapeutic elimination serves institutional agenda prioritizing psychological comfort over authentic spiritual growth through confrontation with ultimate questions governing meaning and purpose within temporal existence, whose limitations provide necessary context for ethical development through acknowledged rather than eliminated suffering serving wisdom acquisition and divine communion through accepted rather than avoided human condition. Adrian encounters previous versions of himself who remain trapped in the forest, each representing different stages of his memorial burials. These partial selves reveal how systematic emotional removal has fragmented his identity across multiple incomplete personas. The congregation of abandoned selves emerges from shadow configurations that suggest human presence, yet resist complete manifestation according to dimensional limitations affecting consciousness, partially detached from normal space-time continuity through memorial burial processes that create existential residue when authentic personality components undergo supernatural storage rather than natural integration through therapeutic processing. Each figure represents specific developmental period when traumatic experience had demanded burial according to psychological crisis patterns, exceeding individual capacity for emotional management, without external intervention, through conventional or supernatural therapeutic methodologies. Adrian at 35 displays characteristics suggesting professional competence, yet lacks emotional depth that should accompany executive advancement through accumulated experience. His truncated personality reflecting systematic removal of workplace trauma through memorial burial that eliminated growth opportunities, alongside psychological distress according to therapeutic approach that prioritized immediate relief over long-term character development through processed adversity serving spiritual maturation. This version speaks with voice that carries professional authority, yet reveals existential emptiness, where authentic wisdom should provide foundation for ethical leadership, serving community welfare rather than merely personal advancement through competitive success. The gathering creates psychological mirror effect that demonstrates cumulative impact of memorial burial upon personality integration across lifespan development patterns, each abandoned self representing crucial growth opportunity sacrificed for temporary comfort through supernatural intervention that serves symptom management rather than authentic healing requiring confrontation with traumatic content whose processing enables wisdom acquisition through transformed rather than eliminated suffering. Adrian recognizes current version of consciousness as merely latest iteration in sequence of progressively diminished personalities whose essential humanity has been systematically excavated through therapeutic methodology that honors comfort over authenticity while serving forest agenda whose ultimate purpose transcends individual psychological welfare toward cosmic objectives requiring human consciousness modification according to supernatural rather than merely therapeutic criteria. The forest formally presents its bargain. It will absorb all of Sarah's suffering, fear, and death itself, preserving only love and joy. In exchange, Adrian must surrender his remaining humanity and serve as the forest's permanent guardian and harvester. Communication achieves clarity that bypasses normal linguistic limitations through direct consciousness interface whose precision eliminates ambiguity while conveying emotional content that rational analysis cannot adequately process despite obvious supernatural origin requiring acceptance of propositions that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality structure and natural law governing material existence within normal dimensional parameters. The forest consciousness explains offer through telepathic transmission, whose authority suggests cosmic, rather than merely local intelligence operating according to principles governing universal memory preservation and human consciousness modification, serving purposes extending beyond individual therapeutic benefit toward systematic species development through environmental partnership. Complete preservation of love content. The forest promises, through Sarah's replicated voice patterns that achieve acoustic perfection, suggesting direct neural access to memory formation processes occurring within domestic environment hundreds of miles distant from current geographical coordinates. Elimination of terminal suffering, death anxiety, and grief trauma. Through immediate burial upon biological cessation according to temporal coordinates, ensuring psychological continuity without interruption through mourning period, whose elimination preserves relationship integrity while preventing survivor trauma requiring additional therapeutic intervention. The proposal encompasses retroactive modification of approaching death experience through prophetic burial that would transform inevitable loss into manageable transition while maintaining emotional benefits derived from 40-year marriage partnership. Exchange requirements involve Adrian's permanent residence within forest territory, serving as interface between human visitors seeking memorial burial services and supernatural consciousness, requiring organic intelligence for continued expansion through systematic accumulation of emotional content, whose processing demands human cognitive architecture for successful integration into cosmic memory preservation systems. This obligation encompasses abandonment of external social relationships, professional responsibilities, and normal human development opportunities in favor of custodial function-serving forest agenda, whose ultimate purpose remains unclear yet obviously extends beyond therapeutic assistance toward systematic modification of human consciousness patterns, according to cosmic, rather than merely individual healing objectives requiring collaborative rather than parasitic relationship between supernatural intelligence and human awareness serving mutual rather than exploitative development goals. Physical reality begins collapsing around the forest as dimensional barriers weaken. Sky disappears, paths disintegrate, and time flows in waves rather than linear progression, leaving Adrian suspended between past and future in a realm that defies natural law. Geographical coherence abandons normal spatial relationships as forest boundaries expand beyond previous limitations through dimensional modification that accommodates supernatural consciousness, whose growth requires environmental revision transcending botanical constraints governing normal woodland development, according to ecological principles that operate within standard physical law, rather than cosmic intelligence serving universal memory preservation through organic, rather than technological storage systems. Sky visibility diminishes through atmospheric opacity that suggests matter density modification, rather than normal weather phenomena affecting light transmission through air molecules, according to optical principles governing electromagnetic radiation behavior within standard environmental conditions. Temporal progression abandons linear sequence as past and future collapse into simultaneous manifestation, creating experiential loops where childhood trauma occurs alongside marital arguments while professional failures blend with anticipated grief patterns whose chronological displacement prevents normal psychological processing through sequential memory formation, serving biographical narrative coherence according to developmental patterns requiring ordered experience for successful personality integration. Adrian observes multiple timeline versions operating simultaneously within overlapping dimensional territories, where causation relationships reflect cosmic, rather than merely physical principles governing event sequences and consequence patterns within supernatural, rather than natural environmental contexts. Path disintegration occurs through systematic elimination of geographical exit routes, whose disappearance prevents departure according to navigational revision, that operates beyond normal spatial modification toward complete dimensional isolation, serving forest agenda, requiring permanent human residence for continued expansion through systematic consciousness. Harvesting whose success depends upon visitor retention through geographical imprisonment rather than voluntary collaboration. The transformation encompasses root system expansion through underground network development that connects surface terrain to subterranean consciousness architecture, whose complexity exceeds normal botanical organization while maintaining organic rather than mechanical characteristics, serving supernatural intelligence, whose growth patterns honor natural rather than artificial development principles, despite obvious cosmic rather than merely terrestrial origin and purpose. As reality continues to fracture around him, Adrian faces the ultimate decision: surrender to the forest's offer and preserve Sarah from suffering while sacrificing his humanity, or reclaim all buried memories and face both their accumulated trauma and her approaching death with full consciousness intact. Decision crystallizes through recognition that forest offer represents genuine compassion whose implementation would eliminate authentic human experience in favor of artificial emotional preservation, serving comfort rather than spiritual growth through acknowledged suffering, whose processing enables wisdom acquisition and divine communion according to developmental patterns that honor both individual resilience and cosmic purposes governing consciousness evolution through temporal existence. Adrian understands that accepting supernatural intervention would constitute betrayal of marriage partnership, whose authentic value derives from shared vulnerability, including grief, loss, and mortality, whose acknowledgement creates intimate bonds transcending romantic sentiment toward spiritual union, requiring courage sufficient for facing ultimate questions together. Alternative choice encompasses reclamation of all buried memories, whose restoration would force confrontation with accumulated lifetime trauma, whose weight exceeds current psychological capacity, yet represents essential foundation for authentic personality integration, serving spiritual maturation through processed rather than eliminated adversity. According to developmental principles governing human consciousness, evolution toward divine collaboration through accepted rather than avoided human condition. This path requires abandonment of therapeutic comfort derived from memorial burial while accepting responsibility for emotional content, whose processing demands courage exceeding normal human capacity, yet serving purposes that transcend individual welfare toward cosmic development through conscious participation in universal consciousness expansion. Environmental pressure intensifies as dimensional instability approaches critical thresholds, requiring immediate decision whose consequences will determine not merely individual fate, but broader implications affecting forest consciousness, whose expansion depends upon human collaboration, yet whose ultimate agenda remains partially concealed despite obvious cosmic, rather than merely therapeutic purposes serving supernatural intelligence, whose development honors organic rather than mechanical principles, while transcending normal natural law through consciousness, rather than technological modification of reality structure. Adrian recognizes approaching moment when choice becomes irreversible, atmospheric tension indicating cosmic rather than merely personal significance, whose resolution will establish precedent affecting future human encounters with supernatural consciousness, seeking partnership through memorial storage systems serving purposes, extending beyond individual psychological welfare toward universal memory preservation through environmental rather than technological methodologies honoring natural rather than artificial development patterns within cosmic, rather than merely terrestrial contexts, whose ultimate purpose remains mysterious yet obviously transcendent. Adrian confronts the forest's ultimatum and makes his decision through profound inner contemplation that weighs love against authenticity, comfort against truth. The moment arrives without ceremony, as consciousness achieves clarity that eliminates hesitation despite magnitude of consequences, whose irreversible nature demands acknowledgement of choice that will determine not merely personal fate, but fundamental relationship between human experience and supernatural intervention serving cosmic purposes, transcending individual welfare. Adrian recognizes that accepting forest offer would preserve marriage content while eliminating essential humanity whose authentic development requires confrontation with mortality, grief, and loss. Serving spiritual maturation through processed rather than avoided suffering according to developmental patterns, honoring both divine purpose and human dignity. I choose truth over comfort. Adrian speaks aloud to forest consciousness, whose intelligence encompasses cosmic perspectives, yet requires human collaboration for continued expansion through memorial storage systems, serving universal memory preservation. The decision emerges through recognition that love's authentic value derives from shared vulnerability, including approaching loss, whose acknowledgement creates spiritual bonds, transcending romantic sentiment toward divine communion, requiring courage sufficient for facing ultimate questions together, rather than separately through artificial emotional preservation, eliminating growth opportunities alongside psychological distress. The forest responds to Adrian's rejection with a mixture of understanding and regret, beginning the complex process of releasing both Adrian and his buried memories back to human consciousness. Environmental response carries weight that suggests disappointment, tempered by cosmic wisdom. Recognizing necessity of individual choice within universal development patterns that honor personal agency despite supernatural intelligence, possessing capacity for beneficial intervention through memorial burial systems, serving therapeutic rather than exploitative purposes. Forest consciousness communicates acceptance through atmospheric modifications that indicate preparation for memorial restoration, according to procedures requiring careful extraction of buried emotional content, whose return demands psychological preparation adequate for managing accumulated trauma, whose weight exceeds normal human capacity for grief processing without therapeutic support systems. Your authenticity serves purposes we cannot. The forest acknowledges through direct telepathic transmission, whose clarity conveys respect for human choice, while expressing genuine regret regarding lost opportunity for collaborative cosmic development through environmental partnership, serving universal memory preservation. Root system vibrations indicate systematic preparation for memorial extraction, whose complexity requires temporal coordination, preventing psychological collapse through graduated restoration, enabling consciousness integration of previously buried traumatic content, according to therapeutic protocols, honoring both supernatural capability and human psychological limitations, requiring careful management during transition periods. The buried memories return to Adrian in a painful but transformative flood, while the forest's dimensional distortions gradually recede, restoring normal space-time relationships as supernatural influence withdraws. Memorial restoration begins through systematic reintegration of buried emotional content, whose return creates psychological pressure, approaching threshold limits yet remaining within therapeutic parameters that prevent complete consciousness. Collapse through graduated exposure enabling successful personality reconstruction according to developmental principles governing authentic human maturation through processed adversity. Childhood trauma emerges alongside marital conflicts, while professional failures blend with accumulated grief patterns whose chronological restoration enables biographical narrative coherence, serving identity formation through acknowledged, rather than eliminated, experiential foundation. Dimensional stability returns through systematic withdrawal of supernatural influence, whose cosmic agenda requires voluntary rather than coercive human participation for successful implementation according to universal principles governing consciousness, evolution, through collaborative rather than exploitative relationships between different forms of intelligence serving mutual development goals. Forest boundaries contract toward original geographical parameters, while temporal progression resumes linear sequence enabling normal causation relationships governing physical reality. According to natural rather than supernatural law serving environmental restoration that honors both human autonomy and cosmic intelligence, requiring partnership rather than dominance for continued expansion through memorial storage systems. Adrian emerges from the forest forever changed, psychologically whole, but bearing the full weight of his memories, prepared to face Sarah's death with complete consciousness and authentic love. The path toward forest exit manifests with clarity that indicates genuine rather than illusory departure opportunity. Environmental cooperation suggesting cosmic intelligence whose agenda encompasses human welfare alongside universal memory preservation according to ethical principles governing supernatural intervention within mortal affairs. Adrian carries complete biographical content, whose integration creates psychological foundation adequate for confronting approaching loss through spiritual resources developed through acknowledged suffering, serving wisdom, acquisition, and divine communion, rather than artificial preservation, eliminating growth opportunities essential for authentic human development toward cosmic consciousness expansion. Sarah awaits his return within domestic environment, whose familiar characteristics now resonate with enhanced significance derived from complete memory restoration, enabling authentic appreciation for relationship content, whose value transcends romantic sentiment toward spiritual partnership requiring shared vulnerability, including mortality, acknowledgement, serving intimate bonds deeper than artificial emotional preservation could achieve through supernatural intervention. Adrian approaches final months of marriage partnership, equipped with psychological resources adequate for serving as authentic companion during terminal illness, whose processing demands courage sufficient for facing ultimate questions together. The forest remains within memory as location of profound choice whose consequences extend beyond personal welfare toward cosmic implications, affecting future human encounters with supernatural consciousness, seeking collaborative rather than exploitative relationships, serving universal development through environmental partnership. Adrian understands that authenticity chosen over comfort serves purposes extending beyond individual spiritual growth toward precedent establishment affecting cosmic, rather than merely terrestrial development patterns governing consciousness evolution through voluntary, rather than coercive participation in universal memory preservation systems, honoring both human autonomy and divine purpose through collaborative rather than dominant relationships between different forms of intelligence, serving mutual rather than exploitative development goals within cosmic context, whose ultimate purpose transcends individual comprehension while remaining accessible through conscious participation in universal consciousness, expansion serving divine, rather than merely personal objectives through environmental cooperation, honoring both supernatural capability and human dignity, requiring respectful rather than manipulative intervention within mortal affairs. In the end, Adrian walked toward home carrying every scar that made him human, ready to love completely because he remembered completely, knowing that some forms of pain become the very foundation upon which authentic joy learns to stand.